grab a seat. Thanks, guys. Well, good evening, everybody. I feel like we could have sat in that for another half an hour. There's just such a real sense of the Lord's presence here tonight, and yeah, that was awesome. Praise you, Father. So this morning, what we did was we kicked off actually a new mini sermon series that's kind of taken us up towards Christmas. And it's actually running for the next wee while across both morning and evening services as well. And this morning, Clive looked at this question of, look, is Jesus real? Was Jesus a real man? What's the evidence say? And where do we land on that today in 2024? But tonight, we're going to continue to probe a bigger question of, well, is Christmas believable? Is everything that we talk about, everything that we celebrate at this time of year and this season, is it believable or is it actually unbelievable? Is it unbelievable in the sense of like, whoa, that's unbelievable? Or is it actually, we're actually going to put ourselves before those hard questions tonight, those claims that people have used down throughout history that actually would maybe, they would use it to say, well, Christmas is actually unbelievable. They might say that it is not believable in the way that the church tells it. Now, if I'm honest, our focus tonight is going to be less about the Christmas story, but more about the books that actually hold those stories, hold those accounts. The books that hold all these stories and the teachings and the miracles and the life of Jesus. And these books that we have and we know today are called the Gospels. We've got 4 of them. We've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These 4 books that recount to us the life and ministry of Jesus here on earth, which of course entails the very story at the heart and at the center of what we as the church, as Christians, celebrate at this time of year at Christmas. So what we're going to do tonight, I suppose, is a little bit of apologetics for the Gospels. Now, the Lord engages our hearts, but actually the Lord also engages our minds, and we're going to lean into that tonight. We're going to engage our minds a little bit. So if you need to give yourself a wee bit of a shake, do that, feel free, but we're going to engage our brains a little bit tonight. And really what apologetics are, it's what I mean by that is we're going to see if we can argue the case a little bit that these books that hold all this incredible life-changing, earth-shattering material about the life of Jesus, we're going to see if they are in fact believable, and we're going to argue that they are and that we can take them seriously. So let's jump in tonight. I wonder here, has anyone ever watched any of those those unsolved crime mysteries on Netflix? We love an unsolved crime documentary in our house. You kind of get so sucked into it that you feel that you become part of the investigative team. You're so immersed in it. You try and work out and get to the bottom of what's really happened. But with so many of these unsolved crimes, one of the biggest challenges that always remains is that when the police come and they reopen this file and the team starts investigating that crime again, after all those years, they now have to deal with a whole range of information. It's been gathered by different people at different times and at different stages all down through the years. Some of the information came at the time of the event. There was witnesses who were there and they've got that information. But then there was people who've come along since then. Maybe people of interest. Maybe someone who's been flagged up as having some important information and they have had to pass that on to the police. And the difficult thing is they have to try their best to remember and to recount details of a crime or an event that took place sometimes 40 or 50 or even 60 years ago. And then you've got the challenge at that point of people's memory and how their memory might be fading or it might be dwindling. It's not easy. And one of the big questions that's posed against the Gospels is this: were these books not written too long after the events that are described within them? Were these books, the Gospels that we have today, were they not compiled and written down too long after the events that are within them? That's a fair question to ask. It's a fair challenge towards the Gospels. Many of us will have heard of the famous scientist and atheist Richard Dawkins. And what Richard says about this is he says that the stories and the accounts that we have in the Gospels, well, they are victim of ultimately Chinese whispers. Remember that game you used to play when you were a kid? This week when I was sort of trying to pull this together, I was really tempted to see if we could do one big game of Chinese Whispers, and then I sort of got it all done and looked at the time and thought, there's no chance we couldn't. But how good would that be? You know the game, no big group of or big circle or a big number of people, and one person starts with it and they pass it along until it gets to the end, and that person stands up and says what the story was or what the message was. And with the Gospels, effectively, it's this idea that somewhere, someone at some point has shared a story and has passed that on to someone else. And after that person has received it, they've then gone and they've shared it with another person, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, along the way, details have been changed. Details have been added, or details have been altered due to the numerous retellings that would naturally happen. Once again, it's a fair challenge. But when we look at it, here's what we see. So firstly, if we take the Gospel of Mark just for a moment as an example, the Gospel of Mark is widely accepted to have sort of been received around 35 to 40 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. And it includes the accounts of a range of eyewitnesses. Now, prior to this Gospel having been written down, the main way that the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus, were shared and were communicated were simply by word of mouth. But what's really important to recognize here at this moment is that when I say word of mouth, the way that they were communicating this wasn't by whispers. It wasn't sitting around a campfire as such and sharing some stories. These Gospels and this message were communicated verbally in synagogues and in amphitheaters. They were shouted loudly in detail. They weren't whispered quietly or loosely chatted about over a cup of tea. Not only this, but there were literally thousands of witnesses to Jesus' miracles throughout his lifetime. Not just one single source that had the task of starting that big old game of Chinese Whispers that would ultimately still be going 2,000 years later and would have spread across almost every nation and people group in the world. There were thousands of witnesses. And not only were there thousands of witnesses, but Jesus, like a rabbi, he had many followers, and they were called disciples, and they would have journeyed with him, listening to his teachings and witnessing his actions. And then within that big group of disciples, he had 12 chosen ones, 12 ones who were so close to Jesus that they went where he went, they ate what he ate, they rested with him, they traveled with him. They were his closest companions. And so even into that scenario of an accusation of Chinese Whispers, you had these 12 disciples and then a larger group outside of that who were on hand to kind of be consulted about what actually went down in those moments. And actually part of the very reason that the Gospels then moved from being written or being communicated verbally to then being written down was because those witnesses, those disciples, well, those who knew and loved and lived alongside Jesus were starting to die off. And what they did was, as you look through these accounts, what you see is the Gospel writers, they were deliberately naming other people within their stories. And effectively what they were doing here is that they were flagging other sources. Mary Magdalene appears here. Yeah, well, okay, go and speak to Mary. If you know Mary, go speak to Mary about this story. See what happened. She'll prove it. She's in the story. She'll tell you the same thing. Go and ask her. Or you've got John's Gospel. Now, John's Gospel is widely accepted as being the eyewitness account of John himself. And actually, so this being the case, what we have in John's Gospel is much less like the idea of the big game of Chinese Whispers where the person at the end stands up and shares the message that's been changed. It's not like that with John's Gospel in the slightest. You can't even accuse him of that. What it is actually like, it's like the moment in the game of Chinese Whispers where the first person stands up and the first person says, this is what the original message was. This is what the truth was, before anybody else got their hands on it, before anybody else changed it. Here's another one. Here's another challenge that maybe people would put against the reliability of the Gospels. Somebody might say, well, could people really remember what happened, what went on 35 or or 40 or even 60 years ago. If that's how long it took from Jesus dying on the cross and then one of the disciples later writing a gospel, could they really remember what went on? Again, completely reasonable question to ask. You know, it's funny, I'm 33, and if you were to speak to my mum about the day that I was born, it's interesting the sort of details that she can give you. She remembers that I was born at around 7 p.m. And the way that she remembers that is because shortly after I was born, she could hear the soundtrack of Coronation Street being played on a TV somewhere at the other end of the ward. And she knew that Coronation Street was always played at around 7:30 or 8 o'clock. So that's how she always remembered. She also remembers that on the day that I was born, my dad was there, thankfully also, but he, in the waiting around, as the men have to do in those moments quite often, he got chatting to another soon-to-be dad. And they got chatting, and in about half an hour's time, the pair of them decided, we should head out for some lunch. So the two dads, the two soon-to-be dads went out for some lunch, and they left the mums in the ward. And apparently, the story goes, they came back and mum had friction burns on her ankles because she was still in the midst of labor, and it was really getting so sore. And she was like, Dad, Philip, where have you been? They'd gone out for lunch, but she remembers all these little details. And then I decided I was going to phone my nana. I phoned my nana and I said, do you remember what it was like when my dad was born? And my dad's 60-something. I won't throw him under the bus, but he's 60-something. And 60-something years ago, my nana can remember it well. Freezing cold day on the 11th of January. Born at 6 p.m. in the Jubilee Hospital, and she went through a really tough labor. She had to have a blood transformation, and she vividly a blood transfusion. Blood transformation, that's another story. A blood transfusion, and she vividly remembers one of the doctors scolding the nurses and saying, this should have been done quite a while ago. And she remembers also vividly leaving the hospital the next day or whatever it was and walking out of the hospital into a big snowstorm. And as they came out and they went home, they then discovered that there was something wrong with the fire, so they weren't able to heat the downstairs of the house, so they had to move everything upstairs, and they were able to have that part of the house warm, but they had to wait until somebody came out and fixed the fire. 60 years ago, and still those moments are sketched into her memory. And of course we don't remember every little detail, of course. We've got this kind of vivid highlight reel of all the most important moments that impacted us the most. But folks, let me tell you this. You may know this already, but some of you might not know this just yet. Meeting Jesus was and is utterly life-changing. Utterly life-changing. To encounter him and to hear him speak, or to watch how he interacted with the poor or the outcast, or to witness him perform a miracle would have been life-changing. 40 or 50 or 60 years would not have erased these memories in the slightest. But then we've also got to consider, with this one here, we've also got to consider that back in the time of Jesus, the practice of any disciple who sat at the feet of their rabbi was to learn the rabbi's teaching off by heart. Similar to the way that like an actor or an actress might sit today and they might learn their script so that they can recite it without even having to glance at the page. That was the tradition in those days with a disciple and their rabbi's teaching. And Jesus had 12 of these disciples. And they carried this message both in their hearts but also on their lips. And just like an actor might travel around the world, taking the stage, reciting their lines, these disciples traveled around sharing the good news of Jesus. So these words that were read in the Gospels, while they might have been written 35 or 40 or sometimes 60 years after Jesus, they were fresh in the minds and the mouths of the disciples who carried them, as fresh as the day that they'd happened. Okay, so we've considered the Chinese whispers theory. We've considered the argument about that it was written too late. But for the rest of our time, I want to take a few moments to think about one last question that has been posed against the reliability of the Gospels. And the question is this: were these stories simply exaggerated? Have they simply just been kind of exaggerated over time? A really, really good and valid question to ask. Because we all love a wee bit of exaggeration, don't we? It comes quite natural to us, actually, sometimes. Any football players here? I bet you there's one or two. We all know the person who loves telling that story about the goal they scored when they were 15 against the Andes Town Alsatians, 4th 11. And it was great. Story seems to have just kind of got a bit more elaborate over the years as it keeps going. The keeper he rolled it from the back and he got it to me and I skinned the first couple of players and then I shrugged off the midfield. I dummied across into the box, so then I stuck the shoulder on and I ran through the defence. I flicked it up, I overhead kicked, top right corner, right through the hands of the keeper, who also, by the way, had trials for Liverpool that week. Just, you have to remember that. But the reality is probably very, very different. The reality was probably that it was a tap-in and the keeper was down injured or something like that. But when it comes to the Gospels, Richard Dawkins, again, that atheist scientist, he says that what we see here is a result of young, passionate, religious men who were really eager to pass on these stories and these rumors of Jesus without actually fact-checking any of it. A miracle here, a virgin birth there, and then all of a sudden what's happened is this charismatic preacher over time has become this divine Son of God. But over time, and that little bit about over time is important because that is generally how exaggeration works. It snowballs and it snowballs and it snowballs until over time you've got something completely elaborate compared to the first story. But here's the thing. There's a bunch of problems with this. There's a bunch of problems which I want to talk about very briefly. And where we see the problems with the whole exaggeration theory the most is when we put it up against the most amazing miracle of Jesus that we read about in those Gospels. The most amazing miracle we read about is his resurrection. Now, we're going to put the resurrection on trial here for a moment, okay? Now, if Dawkins' claim is correct, then what you would expect is that the claim of Jesus' resurrection, it would have developed over time, and therefore it would be found over time in some of the later writings about Jesus, as things have been exaggerated more and more and more until the point has become that this guy has actually died on the cross and he was a great guy, but now he's risen from the dead. But that's not the case when we look at the biblical literature. See, the problem with that exaggeration theory is this. Problem number one is that the resurrection is a major theme in the very earliest known writings about Jesus. There were writings that were dated much earlier than the Gospels, actually the letters of Paul. And the resurrection is so central to those writings as well. Paul didn't preach the Jesus who was a good guy. He didn't even just preach Jesus who was a healer. He didn't even just preach Jesus who was amazing to the poor and the outcast. He preached the resurrected Jesus. He preached an encounter with the resurrected Jesus. And also, if this had been made up by some keen being radical just for the effect, well, there would have been thousands of other witnesses around who would have been there to correct him and put him back in his place. But as we know, these Gospels didn't rely on just one person's testimony. There were many, many people who claimed to have seen and touched and interacted with the resurrected Jesus. So that was problem one. Here's problem two. If we were to say that the early converts to Christianity made up the resurrection, then it's kind of like saying the early Facebook users made up social media. Do you know what I mean by saying that? Because without social media, there would be no Facebook. Well, without the resurrection, there would be no Christianity. The very essence of the Christian message and the thing that makes it what it is the fact that God sent his Son into the world to take on our sin, to pay the price for it at the cross, suffering and dying there, but then rising again, defeating sin and death 3 days later, so that anyone who trusts in Jesus and trusts in that message can live with him forever and can live with him now, here in their heart. Do you see how the resurrection is the driving force for this message? It's not just a little optional extra that kind of gets thrown in there to spice things up a little bit. Without the resurrection, there would have been no Christian movement for the last 2,000 years. Without the resurrection, Jesus would have been just yet another failed Messiah. And off the back of that, we've got problem number 3. See, to exaggerate, but particularly to exaggerate the resurrection, was actually really, really risky stuff. Again, not just something that you kind of just threw out there simply so that you might make a few headlines at the time. This type of chat was actually the sort of thing that could have got people killed. And actually, it did get people killed. Jesus' own brother, James, he spoke about Jesus who had been risen from the dead. And as a result of spreading that message, it got him stoned to death. This wasn't something that someone spoke of to raise their own reputation. It was dangerous. It was risky. And it would have been foolish to simply exaggerate a story to ultimately make such claims which would then result in you facing your own execution. Problem number 4. If someone at the time of Jesus was going to make this up, somebody was going to make this whole resurrection thing up, then they would surely have done their very best to make this as believable as they possibly could within their context and within their time. But as we know, if we have ever read the Gospels, or maybe even if you've just simply been around church around Easter time, the Gospels tell us that the very, very first witnesses to this risen Jesus, to this empty tomb, were women. Now, that might not seem like much to you now, but the implication is significant, because at the time, like, a woman's testimony, it seems strange to even say this, but a woman's testimony didn't count for much back then. A woman's testimony wasn't actually allowed to even be accepted in court. So as these women who had seen the resurrected Jesus, as they went around telling others, and as they ran back to the other disciples to say, Jesus is alive, the grave is, the tomb is empty, he's here, the automatic response would have been like, anyone else see it though? Any men there that might have seen it? They wouldn't have been quick to believe them. Yet, all 4 Gospels present women as the very first witnesses to the empty tomb and to the resurrected person of Jesus Christ. Now that says a lot, but within what we're talking about tonight, what it does say is that it only makes sense if it was indeed true. It only makes sense if it was indeed true. And then lastly, problem number 5 with this idea that the resurrection, the thing that the driving force of the Christian message, the problem with the idea of it being exaggerated is that the Gospels were actually really bad PR. They were not good PR. In many ways, the accounts that we have in the Gospel would have been really quite embarrassing for the people that were named in it, but also actually for the people that would have written these Gospels as well. Join with me for a moment and just think about or imagine your most embarrassing time. Just imagine that moment where you've slipped, or you've got someone's name wrong, or something much worse, and you're super embarrassed. Or maybe actually go a step further. Change it from thinking about your most embarrassing time, but actually think about your most shameful time. Do you know that time that you don't even like to talk about? You definitely don't want anybody else knowing about it. And so you bury it deep down, and you brush it under the carpet, and it never comes back out. Now imagine having that moment written down into 4 different books, and then imagine those books becoming the best-selling books of all time. No thank you. But yet actually, this is what happened. It's what happened to Peter. It's what happened to Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples. That's just one example. The Gospel of Mark is widely understood to have actually been the memories of Peter. Gospel, or Mark, maybe the writer, but it being Peter's memories. Now, if I was Peter, then maybe I would have given into the whole exaggeration thing. Maybe I would have told the story a little differently, just to sort of put me in a position where I looked a little bit more respectable than what I really was. Yet that doesn't seem to be what happened here. Peter has no interest in airbrushing out his shortcomings or his failings. As you read that, what you see is 3 times Peter denies that he even knew Jesus, so that he might not be persecuted or so that he might not be humiliated. We see him draw his sword in anger, and he cuts off the ear of a servant of the high priest when they come to arrest Jesus. We see him called out of the boat to walk on water, and as he journeys toward Jesus, his eyes are fixed on him, and it looks like it's set up to be this most incredible moment. But then Peter looks at the waves around him, and he loses faith. He takes his eyes off Jesus, and he begins to sink. Or we read of Peter and these other disciples trying to keep the little children away from Jesus, and Jesus has to correct them. Like, imagine that was the attitude today. But we know now that's not at all what Jesus wants. We read of him filled with selfish ambition, arguing with the other disciples, who's the greatest? It's me, I'm the best. I want to sit beside Jesus. I want to sit on his right hand. When Jesus reveals to his disciples that he must be put to death before rising again 3 days later, it says in the Gospel of Mark that Peter takes Jesus aside, and it says that Peter rebuked Jesus. But you know what Jesus says back to Peter? He looks at him and he says, "Get behind me, Satan." We read of Peter also unable to stay awake and watch while Jesus is off praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus comes back and he finds Peter and the disciples just flat out asleep. So like I said, if the people writing and communicating the Gospels were privy to a little bit of exaggeration, then it would make sense that there would be some exaggeration to make themselves look a little bit better than what they actually really did. But it's completely the opposite of what we see. Peter, who later goes on after the death of Jesus to become a major leader in the early church, he includes all these details. He doesn't get rid of them. He includes them simply because of their truth. Because these Gospels, these accounts of Jesus are indeed really true. They are true, folks. The very books that hold the story that we celebrate this season and this Christmas, the very books that hold the teachings and the miracles of Jesus, that hold the love of God seen in the fact that God would send his Son into the world to pay for my sin and for your sin, these Gospels are true. It's believable. It's credible. It's worth celebrating. It's worth embracing. It's worth digesting. It's worth reading. It's worth opening your heart to the truths of these Gospels, that they might reveal to each and every one of us the love and the grace and the mercy and the forgiveness and the power of the living God here today as it was 2,000 years ago when Jesus walked the earth in human form. I want to finish with these words from John chapter 8. Verse 31 to 32, it says, "To the Jews who had beloved him, Jesus said, 'If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.' Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." These Gospels, as incredible as the stories are, they are powerful. They are full of power. They are it's God's living word. They have the power to set us free from sin. They have the power to set us free from addiction. They have the power to set us free from our family or our marriage breakdown. They have the power to set us free from the temptations that we're giving into on a daily basis. They are full of power. And as we finish, I want to finish simply with an offer. And I mean, you've been coming around Willowfield long enough, you'll know that we regularly give out these Gospels. But tonight we have Gospels of John that are available for absolutely anyone here tonight. And it might be that you are sitting here and you're thinking, I need to read these stories. I need to see these accounts. If this is really true, and if this is as powerful as him up there is saying, then I need to read it. Well, we have one for you tonight. Or actually, you might be sitting here and saying, yeah, I need my sister to read this. Or I need my friend in work to read this. Please take one. And take it with you. But do not let it just sit in your bag. Don't let the power that has the stories and the accounts that have the power to transform and change lives, don't let them lie in a bag. Put them to good use. Hand them out. I want to pray, and then I'm going to hand just back over to Clive.